An entire generation of Ukrainian men has been consumed by this war. Ukraine is now conscripting 18-year-olds to fight alongside the survivors, which are men mostly in their 40s and 50s. The demographic hole that this war has created will shape Ukraine for the rest of this century, regardless of how or when this war ends. Ukraine's new defense minister addressed parliament with remarkable candor. His numbers were staggering. 200,000 Ukrainian soldiers are officially listed as absent without leave, AWOL. 2 million Ukrainian men are wanted for evading conscription entirely. 2 million men who have refused to register, refused to report, refused to become the next wave of casualties in a war that has no visible end. Now trace the alliance geometry. The United States attacks Iran. Iran retaliates against American bases in the Gulf, against American ships, against American allies in the region. The 2025 pattern repeats but escalates. More Iranian strikes, more American responses. Russia provides Iran with advanced weapons. Russian advisors appear in Iranian command centers. Russian air defense systems protect Iranian targets. At what point does American action against Russian personnel or equipment in Iran become an attack on Russia? At what point do NATO allies become involved? At what point does a confrontation over uranium enrichment or protests become something much, much larger? This is not speculation. This is the logic alliance systems working exactly as it worked in 1914. It produced a world war because alliance geometry transformed a local conflict into a general one.
Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff Kellick.
This episode is airing on YouTube on Tuesday, February 3rd, 2026. Airing on Substack a day earlier, February 2nd. But I am recording this episode in the early morning hours of January 31st, 2026. And at this time, this Saturday, in the waters off Iran, the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group is positioned within striking distance of a nation that the United States bombed 7 months ago. President Trump has threatened an attack far worse than Operation Midnight Hammer. He's threatened this attack if Iran does not agree to American terms. Iran's military has announced that its forces have fingers on the trigger. And 1,500 miles to the north, the war in Ukraine grinds towards its 4th anniversary. 200,000 Ukrainian soldiers are absent without leave. 2 million Ukrainian men are wanted for evading conscription. Peace talks are underway in UAE, but the fundamental question remains unresolved. Territory, security guarantees, and the future of a nation that has lost a generation of its young men. In our last episode, we traced the alliance system that produced World War I, the web of commitments that transformed a Balkan assassination into a continental catastrophe. We watched how defensive alliances became offensive in practice, how automatic commitments removed human judgment from crisis response, and how rational response of each actor to the previous move produced collective suicide. Today we ask, is it happening again? The alliance geometry of 2026 bears a very uncomfortable resemblance to that of 1914. NATO binds 32 nations to automatic response if any member is attacked. And Russia and Iran have signed a 20-year strategic partnership. Russia and North Korea have a mutual defense pact. And China watches from the sidelines as its interest aligned with neither Washington nor its adversaries collapse. A war with Iran could activate Russian commitments. Russian involvement could trigger NATO responses, and suddenly a dispute over protests or uranium enrichment becomes something much, much larger. The founders warned us about this. Washington's farewell address could have been written yesterday. And yet here we are, entangled in alliances that bind American fate to decisions made in Kiev and Tehran, in places most Americans cannot find on a map. I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast. This is episode 4, part B, a contemporary application episode connecting our historical analysis to current events. Today, the tripwires of empire: NATO, Ukraine, Iran, and the alliance logic of 1914. In our main episode, we trace the history of American foreign entanglements from the founders to the present. But in these contemporary application episodes, we examine how historical patterns manifest in today's headlines. The goal is not prediction, but rather pattern recognition. Understanding the dynamics that have produced catastrophe before so that we might recognize them as they unfold and adjust accordingly. A quick note before we begin: the situation in Ukraine and Iran are evolving rapidly. Some specific details may have changed between the Saturday recording and the Tuesday broadcast. But the underlying dynamics, the alliance logic, the escalation patterns, the removal of human judgment from crisis response, these do not change with the daily news cycle. So with that said, let us begin. On February 24th, 2022, Russian forces crossed the Ukrainian border. As I record this, we are approaching the 4th anniversary of that invasion, day 1437. 4 years. Let that settle with you for a moment. 4 years of war in Europe. 4 years of artillery barrages, drone strikes, trench warfare. Trench warfare that would be recognizable to soldiers of 1916. 4 years of cities destroyed, infrastructure shattered, and lives ended or permanently altered. The human cost defies easy comprehension. Ukrainian military casualties are estimated in the hundreds of thousands. Russia has lost over 1 million troops by some estimates, killed, wounded, or otherwise removed from the battlefield. Civilian deaths number in the tens of thousands, but it's likely far higher in occupied territories where accurate counting is impossible. But even the numbers do not capture the full picture. An entire generation of Ukrainian men has been consumed by this war. The men in their 20s and 30s who enlisted or were conscripted in the war's early phases. Largely, they're all gone. Dead, wounded, traumatized. Ukraine is now conscripting 18-year-olds. 18-year-olds to fight alongside the survivors, which are men mostly in their 40s and 50s. The demographic hole that this war has created will shape Ukraine for the rest of this century, regardless of how or when this war ends. On January 14th, 2026, Ukraine's new defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, addressed parliament with remarkable candor. His numbers were staggering. 200,000 Ukrainian soldiers are officially listed as absent without leave, AWOL. They have left their units without permission. Some have fled the country. Some are hiding within Ukraine. Some have simply walked away from positions they no longer believe they can hold. 2 million Ukrainian men are wanted for evading conscription entirely. 2 million men who have refused to register, refused to report, refused to become the next wave of casualties in a war that has no visible end. The Ukrainian media outlet Ukrainska Pravda reports the actual number of desertion cases may be closer to 290,000. The Prosecutor General's office opened over 89,000 new desertion proceedings in 2024 alone, 3.5 times the number from the previous year. And these men are not cowards. Many are men who watched their units destroyed, who saw their friends die for a few hundred meters of ground that was lost the next week, who no longer believe that their deaths will accomplish anything beyond adding to the body count. I want to address something here because I know how this sounds to some listeners. Pointing out these realities is not carrying water for Putin. It is not Russian disinformation. It is acknowledging facts the Ukrainian officials themselves have publicly stated. Defense Minister Fedorov announced those numbers in a speech to the Ukrainian parliament. The Kiev Independent, a pro-Ukrainian publication, has done extensive reporting on the desertion crisis. If you truly care about the Ukrainian people, you must grapple with what is actually happening to them. Not some sanitized version presented by those who want the war to continue indefinitely. In March 2025, shortly after the infamous Oval Office meeting between Presidents Trump and Zelensky, I recorded an episode examining this conflict. Today, within this context, I want to revisit some of the points that I made then because they remain essential to understanding where we are now. I asked a simple question. I asked, if you post, "I stand with Ukraine," with hearts or flags on your social media, are you standing with the citizens or with the oligarchs? Because if you're standing with the citizens, I find it very hard to believe you would support conscripting 18-year-olds to die in a war that, by any objective measure, Ukraine cannot win through military means. The footage is available online. Young men grabbed off the streets, pulled from their homes, forced into vans by conscription officers. It's called bussification in Ukraine. It's not the practice of a democracy defending itself. It's the practice of a state feeding its young into a meat grinder because its leaders will not accept the terms available for peace. Let me also be clear about the military situation. Russia is winning this war. Not quickly, not cleanly, but inexorably. Russian forces control approximately 90% of the Donetsk region. They continue to make slow but steady gains across the front. The much heralded Ukrainian counteroffensive of 2023 failed to achieve its objectives. The Kursk incursion of 2024 gained territory but did not change the strategic calculus. Ukraine cannot sustain a war of attrition against a nation with 3 times its population and vastly greater industrial capacity. This is not defeatism. It is arithmetic. As of this recording, peace talks are underway in the United Arab Emirates, the UAE. President Trump has brokered a short-term energy truce. Russia has agreed not to strike Ukrainian energy infrastructure during the current negotiations because temperatures in Kiev are dropping to negative 20, 24 degrees Celsius, somewhere around minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. The Kremlin says America is, quote, in a hurry to make peace. They're correct. And the question is whether that hurry reflects wisdom or desperation. The core issues remain unresolved. Territory, specifically the Donbass region, which Russia now largely controls, and Crimea. The Crimea is what Russia annexed in 2014. Also at stake are security concerns, security guarantees. What commitments, if any, would prevent future Russian aggression? And of course, the fundamental question that has driven this conflict from the beginning: Ukraine's relationship to NATO. Secretary of State Marco Rubio told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that Donetsk is still a bridge we have to cross. Zelensky has said that the Donbass will be key to any settlement. What neither side is saying publicly is what everyone privately knows. Ukraine will not recover the territory that Russia holds. The question is only what Ukraine receives in exchange for acknowledging that reality. A few points for emphasis. First, on morality. It's true we Americans, hell, it's true most people in the world do not like bullies. We do not like seeing a larger nation invade a smaller one. This instinct is admirable. Though I would point you back to our episode on the Mexican-American War for some historical reality and context. But that episode plug aside, morality requires examining consequences, not just intentions. If our support prolongs a war that Ukraine cannot win, producing hundreds of thousands of additional deaths while achieving nothing strategically, is that moral? At what point does supporting Ukraine become sacrificing Ukrainians? Be a little bit more pointed here. One may think it looks virtuous on a Facebook post or a bumper sticker. But are they the ones sending their 18-year-olds off to the front lines to die? Second, on democracy. Ukraine is not the democracy its cheerleaders imagine. President Zelensky has canceled elections under martial law. Opposition media has been shut down. The independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church has been suppressed, with priests jailed and churches confiscated. Political opponents have been arrested. Now, this is not to say that Ukraine is the equivalent to Russia. It's not. But the framing of this war as democracy versus autocracy is just propaganda. It's not analysis. This is a conflict between two flawed states, both with oligarch power structures, both with corruption problems, both with records of suppressing dissent. Third, on strategy. The stated goal of American policy, weakening Russia, has inarguably backfired. Russia now has improved relations with China. Russia has a mutual defense treaty with North Korea, which has sent troops to fight in Ukraine. Russia has a 20-year strategic partnership with Iran. The war has not isolated Russia. Rather, it's pushed Russia into deeper alignment with America's other adversaries. It's increased its alliances with countries we do not want it allied with. And fourth, on the question that haunts this entire enterprise, what's the end game? If Ukraine cannot win militarily, and we will not allow Ukraine to negotiate from its actual position, then what are we doing? Funding an indefinite war that produces indefinite casualties for indefinite aims? The founders have a word for this: folly. But is it really folly? I ask again what I've asked before in this series: Cui bono? Who benefits? We know some of the answers. It may sound cynical, but it's true nonetheless. Clear beneficiaries are the arms dealers: Lockheed, Raytheon, Northrop, the purveyors of military ordnance with missiles at several $1 million per. Also, foreign aid recipients, people that receive those contracts, which have been documented as going primarily, sometimes over 50%, to corrupt foreign officials. And even more cynically, their lobbying groups in Western Europe and here in the United States, which include their biggest, most prominent lobbyist of all, President Zelensky. In episode 4, we traced the alliance system that produced World War I, the Triple Alliance, the Triple Entente, the geometry of automatic commitments that meant a Balkan assassination could trigger a continental war. Today, the alliance that binds American fate to foreign decisions is called NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty was signed in 1949, 4 years after World War II ended. Its purpose was explicit: collective defense against the Soviet Union. Article 5 of the treaty states that an armed attack against one member shall be considered an attack against them all. For 40 years, NATO served its purpose. It deterred Soviet expansion into Western Europe. The Cold War remained cold, well, at least in Europe. The alliance worked. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. What should have happened next is a question that historians and strategists still debate. What actually happened is a matter of record. NATO did not dissolve. It expanded. In 1999, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined. In 2004, 7 more nations joined, including the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, former Soviet republics that border Russia directly. Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia followed. In 2009, Albania and Croatia. In 2017, Montenegro. In 2020, North Macedonia. In 2023 and 2024, Finland and Sweden, bringing NATO to Russia's northwestern border. 32 nations now bound by Article 5. 32 nations whose security the United States has pledged to defend as if it were American territory. The Russian perspective on this expansion is not difficult to understand. Even if one does not agree with it, you can understand their perspective. If you're having trouble, imagine the situation reversed. Imagine that the Warsaw Pact had won the Cold War, that the United States had fragmented, and that over the following 3 decades, the Warsaw Pact had expanded to include Mexico and Canada, and was now discussing membership for the Republic of Texas or the People's Republic of California. Would Americans view this as a defensive measure? Or would they view it as encirclement? Now, of course, I'm not justifying the invasion of Ukraine. There are other ways to solve a problem. The invasion was illegal under international law. It has produced immense suffering. Putin bears responsibility for the war he chose to start. But understanding is not justification. And if we want to understand why the war happened and why it has proven so difficult to end, we must understand how it looks from Moscow. NATO expansion was the context. Ukraine's potential membership was the trigger. In 2008, at the Bucharest summit, NATO declared that Ukraine and Georgia would become members of NATO. Will become. Not may become. Will become. The timeline was unspecific, but the commitment was explicit. From Moscow's perspective, this was an existential threat. Ukraine is not Poland or even the Baltic states. Ukraine shares a 1,000-mile border with Russia. And Ukraine contains Crimea and Sevastopol, the home of Russia's Black Sea Fleet since 1783. We discussed that in episode 4. Ukraine was, for centuries, for essentially the entire length of the United States' history, part of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. NATO membership for Ukraine would bring the Western allies to Russia's doorstep. It would potentially threaten Russia's access to the Black Sea. It would, in Russia's eyes, complete the encirclement that had been proceeding since 1999. None of this excuses the invasion, but it explains the invasion. And explanations matter if we want to find exits from the catastrophe that we are in. Now, here's the question that Americans must confront, the question that the founders would have asked, the question that too few are asking today. Article 5 commits the United States to treat an attack on Estonia as equivalent to an attack on American soil. Estonia has a population of about 1.3 million people. It shares a border with Russia. It has a significant Russian-speaking minority. It is precisely the kind of place where a provocation, real or manufactured, could occur. If Russia were to move against Estonia to protect Russian speakers, to respond to some alleged provocation, to test NATO's resolve, the United States would be obligated to respond. American soldiers would be sent to fight and die for a small Baltic nation that most Americans have never thought about. Is this wise? Have Americans consented to this? Do they understand what has been committed in their name? The alliance system of 1914 was designed to deter war through certainty of collective response. Instead, it guaranteed that any war would become general war. Article 5 operates under the same logic. It assumes that the certainty of American response will deter aggression. But if deterrence fails, the result is not a limited Baltic conflict, but a war between nuclear powers. Washington warned against entangling alliances that would bind American fate to European quarrels. NATO is the most entangling alliance in American history. It commits America to defend nations from Portugal to Turkey, from Norway to the Baltic states. And unlike the alliances of 1914, the modern alliance includes nuclear weapons. The logic that produced the July crisis, the alliance geometry that transformed Sarajevo into Armageddon, that logic did not die in the trenches. It operates today with stakes that are higher than anything the statesmen of 1914 could have imagined. If a conflict between Russia and a Baltic state activates Article 5, the escalation ladder extends to nuclear exchange. There are no clear off-ramps. The same dynamic that trapped the cousins Nikki, Willie, and Georgie in a war none of them would have wanted could trap leaders today in a confrontation that ends civilization. The founders understood this danger. They warned against it explicitly and repeatedly, and we ignored them. Also, as I record this episode, the United States and Iran are engaged in a confrontation that could, through dynamics we have traced throughout this series, produce consequences far beyond the Middle East. Let me summarize where we are. In June 2025, 7 months ago, the United States launched Operation Midnight Hammer. American bombers struck 3 Iranian nuclear facilities: Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. It was the first time the United States had attacked Iranian soil directly. 125 aircraft were involved. The strikes were coordinated with Israel's 12-day war against Iran. Iran retaliated by attacking Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. They did so because it hosts American forces. The immediate crisis passed, but the underlying tensions did not resolve. Iran's economy collapsed under sanctions. The rial fell to historic lows. In late December and early January, massive protests erupted across Iran, protests that the government suppressed with lethal force. The UN Special Reporter estimates that at least 5,000 protesters were killed. President Trump seized on the protests. He threatened military intervention to support the demonstrators. To quote what he wrote on Truth Social, "We are locked and loaded and ready to go." Iran's leaders responded with their own threats. The Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council warned that American intervention would produce chaos in the entire region and the destruction of U.S. interests. The protests subsided. Trump claimed credit for preventing executions, a claim Iran disputes. But the underlying confrontation continues. And then on January 28th, 2026, 3 days ago from when I'm recording this, Trump escalated again. He announced that a massive armada was heading toward Iran, led by the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln. He demanded that Iran agree to a nuclear deal, no nuclear weapons, or face attack far worse than Operation Midnight Hammer. This quotation, "As I told Iran once before, make a deal." They didn't, and there was Operation Midnight Hammer, a major destruction of Iran. The next attack will be far worse. Don't make that happen again. Iran's response was defiant. The foreign minister announced that Iran's military forces have their fingers on the trigger and would immediately and powerfully respond to any American attack. Now, here's where the alliance logic of 1914 becomes directly relevant. On January 17th, 2025, a year ago, Russia and Iran signed a comprehensive strategic partnership treaty. This is a 20-year agreement covering military cooperation, intelligence sharing, economic coordination, and mutual support against what both nations call Western hegemony. The treaty does not include a mutual defense clause like NATO's Article 5 or Russia-North Korea pact signed in 2024, and Russia is not obligated to defend Iran militarily if Iran is attacked. But the treaty does commit both parties to specific behaviors. Article 4 provides for intelligence sharing and security cooperation. Article 6 commits both nations to coordination of activities at the regional and global levels as an important component of maintaining regional and global security. And critically, their treaty states that if either party is subjected to aggression, the other party shall not provide any military or other assistance to the aggressor that contributes to the continuation of aggression. What does that mean in practice? It means that if the United States attacks Iran, Russia is committed, at minimum, to not assisting the United States. But the treaty language is broader than mere neutrality. It commits both parties to try to strive to resolve the conflict through diplomacy on the basis of the UN Charter. More significantly, it opens the door to Russian military support for Iran. The treaty provides for joint military exercises, defense technology sharing, and coordination against shared threats. Russia could provide Iran with advanced air defense systems, S-400s for example, that would make the future American strikes far more costly. Now trace the alliance geometry. The United States attacks Iran. Iran retaliates against American bases in the Gulf, against American ships, against American allies in the region. The 2025 pattern repeats but escalates. More Iranian strikes, more American responses. Russia provides Iran with advanced weapons. Russian advisors appear in Iranian command centers. Russian air defense systems protect Iranian targets. At what point does American action against Russian personnel or equipment in Iran become an attack on Russia? At what point do NATO allies become involved? At what point does a confrontation over uranium enrichment or protests become something much, much larger? This is not speculation. This is the logic alliance systems working exactly as it worked in 1914. Austria-Hungary's ultimatum to Serbia was meant to humiliate a small Balkan nation. It produced a world war because alliance geometry transformed a local conflict into a general one. American strikes on Iran are meant to prevent nuclear proliferation, but they could produce a wider war because alliance geometry transforms a regional conflict into something larger. And there's another dimension to this we have not even yet addressed. Russia and North Korea signed a mutual defense treaty in June 2024. Unlike the Russia-Iran partnership, this treaty includes explicit mutual defense obligations. If either party is attacked, the other is obligated to provide military assistance. North Korea has already sent troops to fight in Ukraine. Estimates suggest 10,000 or more North Korean soldiers are currently deployed in Russia. The alignment is clear. Russia, Iran, North Korea, and hovering in the background, China, which has its own strategic partnership with Russia and its own interests in a multipolar world order. Against this alignment stands NATO, along with Israel and the network of American treaty allies in Asia and the Middle East. This is not the Cold War's bipolar structure. It is more fluid, more complex, and potentially more dangerous. The Cold War had clear lines, established protocols, and decades of experience managing crises. The emerging structure has none of these things. What it has is the alliance logic of 1914, automatic commitments that could transform a local conflict into general war. The founders warned against this. Madison wrote that constant warfare would produce a progressive direction of all its effects to the executive department. the concentration of power that always accompanies military conflict. Washington warned against passionate attachment to foreign nations that could drag America into wars not in its interest. We did not listen. And now the USS Abraham Lincoln steams toward Iran while peace talks in the UAE attempt to end one war, even as the machinery of another grinds into motion. I want to step back from this specific crisis, and I want to address you directly. Throughout this series, I've tried to trace patterns, the recurring dynamics that produce American foreign entanglements, and the cost these entanglements impose. The goal is not to provide answers, but to equip citizens to ask better questions. Because ultimately, this is about citizenship. In a republic, foreign policy is supposed to reflect the will of the people. Wars are supposed to be fought for people's interest and with the people's consent. But the alliance commitments that could drag America into war with Russia or Iran or both, these were not debated in town halls. They were not the subject of national referenda. They were made by elites in diplomatic settings with minimal public attention. Most Americans could not tell you what Article 5 obligates us to. Most Americans do not know that we have committed to defend Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania as if they were American soil. Most Americans are unaware that a 20-year partnership now links Russia and Iran in ways that could transform a Middle Eastern conflict into something much larger. The founders designed a system in which the people's representatives would debate and declare war. They did not anticipate alliance structures that could produce war through automatic escalation, bypassing democratic deliberation entirely. This is the deepest problem. Not the specific policies, those though are problematic enough, but the removal of the American people from decisions about war and peace. As I said in my March 2025 episode on Ukraine, I wanted listeners to think through these issues logically, as independent-minded people, not carrying water for Putin, not towing the line for Zelensky, not accepting narratives funded by Russian propaganda or USAID and CIA information operations pushed through major media outlets. And that remains my goal. The questions we should be asking are not complicated. They are questions the founders would have asked. Does this serve American interest? Not Ukrainian interests, not Israeli interests, not the interest of the rules-based international order. American interest. Have the American people consented? Have they consented through their representatives, through genuine democratic deliberation? Have Americans agreed to the commitments being made in their name, in their children's name? What are the costs? Not just in dollars, though those are significant, but in lives, in liberty, in the constitutional structure that is supposed to protect from concentrated power. When I talk about the cost in liberty, some people think, well, how does that tie back? We're talking about foreign conflicts. How does that tie back to domestic liberty? I'll refer you to several episodes we've already done, but I will point specifically the outcome of blowback. Wars do not stay away from America's shores. Terrorism. Threats come to the United States. Those threats are addressed in part by taking away the freedoms of every American in the name of safety. Americans' liberties are threatened. by our foreign entanglements. And finally, what is the end game? Where does this lead? What does success look like? And if success is undefined or unachievable, why are we pursuing it? What are we doing? The alliance system of 1914 was created by intelligent people pursuing reasonable objectives. Each alliance was defensive. Each commitment made sense in isolation. But together, they produced the greatest catastrophe in human history to that point. We are not immune to similar dynamics. The logic of alliance, the automatic commitment, the removal of judgment from crisis response, that logic has not changed because we have nuclear weapons. It has become more dangerous. We've covered a bunch today. We've connected some dots. We've brought things together from what we're studying here in history, and it becomes all too familiar, all too close to where we are now. We examine the current state of the war in Ukraine, day 1,437, with 200,000 soldiers AWOL, 2 million men evading conscription, and peace talks underway that may or may not produce a settlement. We confronted the human cost of a war that has consumed a generation of Ukrainian men and shows no sign of ending on terms that Ukraine supporters would consider acceptable. We trace NATO expansion from its Cold War origins to its current configuration, 32 nations bound by Article 5, including Baltic states that border Russia directly. We asked whether Americans understand the commitments made in their names, in their children's names, and whether those commitments serve American interest. And we examine the current confrontation with Iran, the threats, the counter threats, the military deployments, and the alliance geometry that could transform a regional conflict into something much larger. The Russia-Iran partnership, the Russia-North Korea mutual defense pact, the emerging alignment of states opposed to American hegemony. All of this creates conditions for escalation that the founders would have recognized immediately. The pattern we traced in episode 4, the alliance logic of 1914, is not history, it is present. It operates today and forms the statesmen of that era would also recognize. The question is whether we will learn from that history or repeat it. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been episode 4B of Empire of Liberty, America's foreign entanglements from the founders to the forever wars, on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page, subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit the notify button. Our Substack page is at consequentialactions.com, where you will find all of our written articles, as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause and the New Leviathan. For video episodes, subscribe to the YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast. And follow me on X at Jay Kellick for updates, discussion, and announcements. We continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Until next time, have a great day.